Cool, we're recording. Great. Hi everyone, my name is Scarlett. I'm a third year doing politics and philosophy at St Hilda's College. I'm here hosting the second event of PWIP's Non-Violent Revolution series, and today we're going to be focusing on the history of feminist revolution. So the plan is roughly, I'm going to introduce PWIP and the project, as well as each of our 5 amazing guest speakers, and then we're going to come to each speaker for 10 to 15 minutes. They're going to give some introductory remarks, and then I'll ask them to pose some questions to each other off the back of these remarks and engage in an open discussion. And then we'll open up the floor to everyone else for a Q&A. So if you have any questions or want anyone to talk a little bit more about something which comes up in the discussion, just write it down and we'll come back to you at the end. Cool. So People for Women in Philosophy, also known as PWIP, is a non-hierarchical group of individuals who provide an inclusive space for all those who study philosophy, as well as engage with broadening conceptions of philosophy. The group was created 2 years ago and has been gaining momentum ever since. We aim to address long-term systemic issues within philosophy at Oxford and further afield by proactively engaging with our own learning. We recognise the importance of making space for marginalised groups and ideas, both within the formal curriculum and broader life, and so really celebrate our ability to bring alternatives to the forefront of students' philosophical journeys. Our team run philosophy essay writing workshops, mentorship schemes, and interview academics from marginalised groups, as well as hosting lectures and discussion groups. To find out more about what we do, take a look at the PWIP blog. The Non-Violent Revolution series aims to publicly address commonly entertained contradictions in the particular revolutionary topic of each panel, and to unpack these contradictions, these oversights and problems, to challenge the irresponsibilities of uncritical thought by engaging us in critical inquiry. Our broader concern covers the violence that perpetuating uncritical thought inflicts and how non-violence is spoken about and enacted surrounding revolutions and revolutionary thought. I am honoured to introduce our panel of guest speakers who are going to help us navigate this topic. The first is Aili Tripp. She's the Wangari Maathai Professor of Political Science and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Currently, she's a fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC, where she's working on a project on women's rights and authoritarianism in Africa. Tripp's research has focused on women and politics and women's movements in Africa, women and peace building, transnational feminism, African politics, and the informal economy in Africa. She's conducted extensive research for over 30 years throughout Africa. Her most recent book is Seeking Legitimacy: Why Arab Autocrats Adopt Women's Rights. She's also author of several award-winning books, including Women and Power in Post-Conflict Africa. She's been the president of the African Studies Association and vice president of the American Political Science Association, and is currently an associate editor of the American Political Science Review. Anna Dobrowolska is a PhD student at Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the history of sexuality in state socialist Poland, and she's currently investigating whether the category of sexual revolution can be applied to the history of the communist bloc. She's particularly interested in transnational flows of knowledge, practices, and ideas about sexuality during the state socialist period. Previously, she studied history and sociology at the University of Warsaw, and her master's thesis explored the history of prostitution and sex work in post-World War II Poland. Manisha Sinha is Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and Civil War and Reconstruction. Her research focuses on 19th century United States history, transnational histories of slavery, abolition and feminism, the history and legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Her multiple award-winning second monograph, The Slave's Cause: A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. It was named Book of the Week by Times Higher Education and one of 3 great history books of 2016 in Bloomberg News. She's been the recipient of numerous fellowships and honours, lectured internationally, and written for a diverse range of newspapers and journals. She's currently writing a book on the greater reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War. Shreya Atrey is an associate professor in international human rights law and a fellow of Kellogg College. She's affiliated to the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights Law and is an associate member of the Oxford Human Rights Hub. She was the Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute from 2016 to 17, and a House of Postdoctoral Global Fellow at the NYU School of Law from 2015 to 2016. Her research is on discrimination law, feminist theory, poverty and disability law. Her monograph, Intersectional Discrimination, which won the runner-up Peter Burke's Book Prize in 2020, presents an account of intersectionality theory in comparative discrimination law. Shreya is currently working towards a project on equality law in times in crisis funded by the British Academy. And finally, Tess Little is a writer, historian and fellow of All Souls College, University of Oxford. Her research focuses on 1970s women liberation movements. Her PhD thesis looks at feminist activism from a transnational perspective through a case study of movements in the UK, US and France. Her short stories and non-fiction have appeared in Words and Women, the Maze Anthology, the Belleville Park Pages, and the White Review. Her first novel, The Octopus, was published in April this year. Brilliant. So obviously this topic is quite broad, and when putting the panel together, I wanted to make sure that we were as inclusive as possible. Feminist revolutions and women's movements have had a rich and diverse international history, which is often distilled down to the white liberal tradition. So to allow them to properly pick apart each of their areas of expertise, I gave our panelists some pretty general prompts. The origins of and relations between women's movements internationally, relations between feminist activism and other forms of activism, potential problems with historical feminist revolutions, legacies of anti-violence, intersectionality and the of abolitionism, problems with universalizing the experience of women, and how useful is the term feminist revolution. So we're now just going to come to each speaker, starting with Manisha Sinha. Go for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scarlett, for that introduction, and thank you, PWIP, for hosting all of us today. As Scarlett mentioned, I'm a historian of abolition, and I am going to be talking today about abolitionist feminism. It's not a term that is commonly used for women in the abolition movement in the 19th century, and I think it is so important for us to recover the historical origins of many of the concepts that we are familiar with today in the abolition movement. So much of my remarks today will be drawn from my book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which was published in 2016, particularly the chapter on the woman question. So if you're interested in getting further information on it, I would recommend going to the book. But let me just start off by saying that when we think of intersectionality, the notion of overlapping and multiple oppressions based on gender, race, class, or any other axis, we think of it as a modern concept, something that 20th century feminists first developed. And actually, I would argue that African-American women within the abolition movement were talking about this for a very long time, much before its modern discovery. So if we go right back to the 18th century, I will begin, in fact, with Mary Wollstonecraft. I believe there's some controversy about a statue of hers in England right now. And Olympe de Gouges, the French feminist thinker, they started writing about women's rights within Western discourse. If you want to think about women, writing about women's rights in Asian countries, you could actually go further back, especially in China and in India. But let's begin with the early modern period and the Age of Revolution, when the notion of rights and the talk of rights and citizenship became very common in Western European discourse. And certainly women like Wollstonecraft and de Gouges laid a claim for women's citizenship and women's rights in the most broad manner, of course, beginning with Wollstonecraft's iconic Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. Now, what's not known, though, is that before she wrote that, she actually wrote a review of a slave narrative that was very famous in the movement to abolish the slave trade in Britain. It was a narrative written by Olaudah Equiano, an Afro-British abolitionist. And she wrote a kind of a really complimentary review of this narrative. And I think it's important to see how the struggle for Black rights and women's rights in the Age of Revolution overlap right from the start, right from the origins. Even if you go back further than Mary Wollstonecraft, you get somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American woman who published her book of poems in 1773. She's not just one of the first Black women to be ever published. She's one of the first American women to be ever published. And her book was published in London. She was well known in revolutionary circles, and then was seen as a sort of a founding mother of abolitionist feminism by many in the 19th century. You go further down to the 19th century, and you can see this sort of overlap, the intersectionalism for the fight against racial inequality, the fight against slavery, and women's inequality, sort of really blossoming, especially in the United States. But the one woman who was actually quite crucial to this sort of fruition of this struggle is a British woman by the name of Elizabeth Herrick, a Quaker woman who wrote her famous pamphlet in 1824, Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, asking for the immediate abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Now, what's interesting about Herrick is that she kind of personified that intersectionalism that I'm talking about. She wrote pamphlets and books not just against slavery, but also for women's rights, vindicating women's involvement in the abolition movement, challenging figures like Wilberforce and Clarkson and other well-known British abolitionists to give up on gradualism and to really talk about the immediate uncompensated, in her view, uncompensated to slaveholders abolition. So she was on the radical side of the British abolition movement. What's also interesting about her is that she also published a pamphlet that vindicated the rights of labor and called attention to the miseries of the British working class with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. So in her work, I actually a little stunned that she is not revered more within the narrative of British abolitionism. She certainly was very influential for American abolitionism. Many people in the United States, especially women abolitionists, Quakers, because Herrick was a Quaker, and there was this kind of Quaker connection between Britain and the United States, were very influenced by her, including Black women abolitionists like Maria Stewart, like Sarah Mapps Douglas, and the Fortin sisters. What's interesting about Maria Stewart, the Black woman abolitionist, is that she is the first American woman to speak publicly for women's rights and for Black rights. She was known to address what was known then as promiscuous assemblies of men and women, Blacks and whites, and got into some trouble for doing that. Before her, and only Frances Wright, who was a radical in her own account, had addressed public assemblies in the United States. Now, in the 1840s, this intersectionalism within the abolitionist movement, again, was carried forward by abolitionist feminists like Frederick Douglass and Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller is not very well known, but she was probably one of the greatest American feminist thinkers of the 19th century. Very much like Wollstonecraft, her book, Woman in the 19th Century, is seen as an iconic feminist text. What's interesting about Fuller is that in this text, she talks about things that we think we have discovered. She talks about troubling the notion of gender and transgender in ways that I don't think many people today are aware of. So her book is certainly worth looking at in terms of thinking of our conception of gender. Like Wollstonecraft, who wrote one of the first favorable reviews of Equiano's book, Fuller wrote one of the first favorable reviews of Frederick Douglass's iconic slave narrative in the New York Tribune, which was a very famous, well-known newspaper in the United States in the 19th century. You know, Karl Marx actually wrote for that newspaper as a foreign correspondent. So it was a newspaper that gave voice to abolitionists, feminists, and radicals of all sorts. And you have the emergence of many Black women abolitionist feminists and white abolitionist feminists even before the iconic Seneca Falls moment in 1848, the famous Women's Rights Convention, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. We many times forget these Black and white abolitionist feminists. We think of the rise of feminism in the United States as an entirely white women's project, beginning with Seneca Falls. And many historians have shown that that is simply not accurate. There were demands being made for women's rights long before. For me, what was more interesting was discovering these unknown Black women within the abolition movement who are making these demands. One of them was a woman by the name of Mary Mills, who 2 years before Stanton wrote in 1846 about the triple burden that Black women in particular suffered. She mentioned gender, race, and poverty, class. So again, that kind of intersectionalism that we think we have discovered, Black women, abolitionist feminists are talking about this for a very long time. You can see this develop in the women's rights conventions of the 1850s, when abolitionist men and abolitionist feminists got together and held series of national, state, and local conventions demanding not just women's rights, but also an end to slavery and Black citizenship in the American Republic. This coalition of abolitionist feminists was mainly people like Lucy Stone, who organized most of these conventions, and then Stanton and Anthony, who later on joined these conventions. They split after the Civil War over the Reconstruction constitutional amendments that enfranchised Black men, but not women. What's interesting is that most of the old abolitionist feminists refuse to follow Stanton and Anthony. They insist on supporting those amendments, saying that that is what they have been fighting for all along, that it has never been just a fight for purely women's rights. It's a fight for women's rights linked to the oppressions of other disfranchised groups in the nation. So what I argue ultimately is that this split was unfortunate, because then you have the emergence of a women's movement that has lost that intersectional perspective of these early abolitionist feminists and ends up being what we commonly know as the, quote, the white women's movement that marginalizes and segregates Black women. And only today we are rediscovering prominent African-American suffragists who continued that intersectional vision of the abolition movement, people like Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign, of course, like Douglas, she toured England, and people like Mary Church Terrell, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, all these women who kept arguing that women's rights was a subset of a broader struggle against oppression that included African Americans, that included Native Americans who were being dispossessed of their lands. And I think it is only, I can't help but end here and say that it is somewhat symbolic, but also important that today, the first woman to be elected to one of the highest offices in this country happens to be a Black woman, a woman of color. And I think in many ways, her victory symbolizes this very long struggle that abolitionist feminists, white and Black, waged in order to sort of link feminism with other struggles in this country. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't gone too much over my time, and I will yield the floor to whoever the next speaker is.
I just want to say, thank you so much for that brilliant start. It's clearly so important for our political projects to look at like the roots of these historical movements. So there's a really good start to like locate it in history. We can clearly like learn a huge amount from these women who have, you know, been forgotten almost, and who push for that revolutionary intersectional thought. So really good place to start. Thank you so much. If we can move on to Aili Tripp now, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Famous unmuting. So thank you so much, Scarlett and others, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be involved in this project. Today I'll talk about war, revolution, and the expansion of women's citizenship. And I'd like to suggest a way of thinking about how women's political rights have changed and expanded, drawing on my own work in Africa. And today I'll argue that women's political rights globally have often, not always, but often expanded more rapidly at critical junctures, like Civil War, or after Civil War, after international wars, after wars of liberation and revolution. And while there are multiple paths to women's suffrage and to women's political representation in legislatures, the opportunities that emerge with the end of conflict and revolution show that the expansion of women's political rights can be speeded up as an unintended byproduct of social rupture, especially when combined with pressures from women's movements and women's rights activists. We saw this after the 1905 Russian Revolution that led to the Grand Duchy of Russia, Finland, becoming the first country in Europe to allow for universal suffrage and the right for women to run for legislative office in 1906. Finland's parliament was the first in the world to seat women, as 19 women were elected to office in 1907 in a parliament of 200 representatives. We saw this again after the Russian Revolution in 1917. There were, as a huge women's movement that pushed demonstrations of 40,000 women that pushed for suffrage, and they got it. World War I sped up processes of change, however inadvertently, as an unintended byproduct of conflict. For maybe Manisha can dispute this, but let's say around 70 years, women's organizations had been fighting for suffrage in the US and Europe. But it wasn't until after World War I that laws were changed granting women the right to vote in many European countries and the US. Circumstances could not have been more different at the end of World War II, which famously did not bring about such changes in female citizenship, partly because there was no mobilization of the kind that we saw prior to World War I. Switzerland, which because of its neutrality position did not experience war that would have disrupted its elite structures and gender regime. As a result, Switzerland did not grant women the right to vote until 1971, and in one canton it was as late as 1990. In my 2015 book, Women in Power in Post-Conflict Africa, I showed how most of the 17 countries that had experienced major conflict in Africa ending after 1995, they had significantly higher rates of female political representation and more gender-related reforms than other countries in Africa. Women make up, for example, 61% of the legislative seats in post-conflict Rwanda today. That's the highest rate in the world. Post-conflict Liberia was the first country in Africa to have a female elected president. The dominant party in post-conflict Namibia, SWAPO, adopted a gender zebra policy, which meant that women and men share governance so that women and men both have 50% of the positions in government and parliament and state-owned enterprises. Uganda, where I've done a lot of work, was the first country in Africa where we saw a large jump in legislative representation of women following conflict. And the conflict ended in '86, but you saw the changes after '89. I've also worked more recently in North Africa, in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. And in Algeria, after 2 decades of civil war that ended in 2002, there were a series of constitutional and legislative reforms. And so you saw that women's representation in legislatures in Algeria jumping from 2% prior to the civil war to 32% after the 2012 elections. 1/3 of the cabinet was made up of women, which was one of the highest percentages among Arab countries. And if you go beyond Africa, you can see the similar patterns in Nepal, in Timor-Leste, in Nicaragua in the same period. And again, it was linked to women's mobilization. I argue, at least for the African cases, that these differences can be accounted for by 3 factors. First, the decline of major conflicts created opportunity structures that women could take advantage of. One can see what William Sewell refers to as cascading effects during these periods of turmoil, in which major historical events then trigger a series of consequences that transform structures and practices. So women's rights activists then pressed for their demands for a women's rights agenda during peace talks, and then that was followed by elections, where they also often would push to get women represented. And then you had truth and reconciliation commissions and constitutional making exercises in which women inserted themselves. And then this was then followed by legislative reform and other changes had ripple effects within other sectors of society, not just in politics. So for example, women in the labor force in Algeria or in Uganda, you saw it in the business sector. Uganda has one of the highest rates of female entrepreneurship in the world today. Second, because of women's experiences during war, both as fighters and as peacemakers, often this gave them common cause, and they mobilized around these concerns through autonomous women's movements. The end of conflict disrupted traditional gender roles very often, and it created incentives for women to demand greater rights and representation. And third, post-conflict countries tended to be more easily impacted by international influences and the new norms that emerged, especially after the 1995 UN conference for women in Beijing. And so because of the increased donor presence in these post-conflict countries and the changing international norms, you saw the influence of external actors more prominently in post-conflict countries. In one of the findings of my most recent 2019 book, Seeking Legitimacy, Why Arab Autocracies Adopt Women's Rights, was that the expansion of political rights also occurred after critical junctures in the Maghreb, in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. After the Arab uprisings in 2011, both Morocco and Tunisia passed major constitutional reforms improving women's rights and political representation, and that was then followed by legislation. And so they passed laws to adopt quotas for women in the legislature, in local councils. In Tunisia, for example, women make up almost 30% of the cabinet and 47% of the local councils. That's higher than France, Germany, most countries. They also have 25% of the parliamentary seats. More recently, we've witnessed women making similar difference in the 2019 Sudanese revolution against the al-Bashir government, which is often referred to as a women's revolution, explicitly as a women's revolution. Two major coalitions of women were at the forefront of this movement for democracy and change. Women also bore a large part of the brunt of the violence as they faced sexual harassment and rape. They protested poor representation in the transition period, the negotiations. They felt that they had made up 70% of the protesters, but they had not been given adequate representation. And so they pressed for a minimum of 50% of the leadership roles in government. And in the end, they got 40% in the proposed constitution. The draft constitution now has 40% women in the Transitional Legislative Council. And they have a slew of provisions for women around women's rights in the Constitution. Right now, they have 4 women in the cabinet. It's not ideal, but it's the first time they've had women in the cabinet. Sudan also just recently repealed the notorious public order law, which allows police to beat women who wear trousers, and targeting them for all kinds of random abuses, dancing at parties, vending on the street, begging. In 2020, they banned FGM, female genital mutilation. And perhaps most importantly, the draft constitution of Sudan now has removed Sharia as a basis of family law, which then opens up many possibilities for legislative change. And so again, you see the very direct connection to revolution and women's role in the revolution. In Africa, so conflict has both speeded up and resulted in greater impacts than other trajectories. So there are other ways of getting there, but this has been an important one. And the question one might ask is, how long are the reforms sustained after conflict, and how deeply do they impact society? In other words, do they just remain at the level of legal reform, or do they have a deeper impact? And then also, what are the scope conditions for change, which I've articulated for civil war in Africa, but in these other wars, I'm not so sure what those conditions are. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can have a discussion later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Let's move on to Anna now.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I won't probably tell a story as optimistic as Aili did, because my story is a story of backlash against women's rights, and a backlash covered with slogans of feminist or liberal revolution. That happened not so long ago and not so far away, because it's actually happening right now in Poland. And some of you may be familiar with the recent protests that took the streets of Warsaw and other Polish cities, with over 400,000 people protesting against the recent ban on abortion that was introduced by the unlegitimate constitutional tribunal, which is of course a completely different case of like legal challenges to the problem. But what I want to focus on is how the memory and the history of women's organization, women's activism under communism, and actually how this activism was forgotten in the last 30 years, influences our possibilities for advocating reproductive rights, advocating women's equality in post-communist sphere, but in particular in Poland, which is because of the influence of the church and rather traditional gender norms, is a very peculiar example of that. So in the 1990s, liberal intellectuals, after the Berlin Wall fell and after Poland regained its independence from the Soviet Union, liberal intellectuals welcomed the rise of so-called Western-style feminist activism, and some commentators went as far as to claim that this is the feminist revolution happening on the streets of Poland in the 1990s. So by Western style, I mean grassroots organizing, huge public manifestations and political actions. Yet simultaneously, alongside with this liberal feminism, the liberals, liberal politicians also restricted women's rights quite significantly. And female workers in huge state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises were fired as part of great privatization programs, as part of neoliberal transformation of the economy. Many of them, because of their age, did not return to the workforce at all. Many of them were forced into very precarious retirement or other precarious part-time job. So that was one side of the coin. And the other side of this side of the coin, the other part of this story was also that while these intellectuals pronounced liberal revolution and pronounced freedom for everyone once the communism finally ended, in 1993, they agreed to restrict access to abortion significantly. So from 1993 up to this day, or rather yesterday, there were only 3 cases in which an abortion was deemed legal. It was due to fetal defections, to the danger of woman's life, and the third one is if a pregnancy results from a crime. So, and what they're trying to do right now is to take out this first clause, so the fetal defects clause. But in 1999, this new law on abortion was pronounced to be a great compromise, although it was a compromise between male liberal intellectuals or politicians and Catholic Church, because women were not even invited to the table to discuss these issues. There were over 1,500,000 signatures for like arguing for a referendum on this issue, and they were simply not given the floor to discuss it even in the parliament. So, since 1993, no more than 1,500 legal abortions have been conducted each year in Poland. So this was a huge restriction of women's rights, and yet everyone in the public sphere was like saying that this is the moment when Poland was catching up with the West, that Poland was finally a member of the liberal Western democracies, and that this was the time that freedom finally came to be there for everyone. So, and what's interesting for me as a historian of communist Poland is that the not so far away history of the reproductive regime before 1989 was so quickly forgotten. And I have some intuitions about why it was so, and it has very much to do with the way we understand feminism, or like the way liberal intellectuals understand feminism. So, yeah, and to understand it better, let's turn to 1956, when the liberal abortion law was introduced in Poland and in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe following the similar developments in the Soviet Union. So when in 1956 abortion was legalized for so-called social grounds, which basically meant abortion on demand, it was made under pressure from doctors and under pressure for medical reasons, basically, and under pressure from women's state-run organizations, such as League of Women, who were obviously directed by party officials, but at the same time they represented grassroots women's organizing in factories and in local circles. And they are campaigning for repelling the outdated laws that and in general for campaigning for planned motherhood and more modern sexual education, resulted in a very modern, for at that time, a legislation being passed by the Polish parliament. And I think it's very telling, if we were speaking about catching up with the West, that in 1956, Poland and other countries of the bloc had this very liberal reproductive regime, while other countries in the West needed to wait until late 1960s or even 1970s for similar regulations to be adopted. So we see a huge disparity in terms of the dynamics of the change. And but this change was not due to Western style grassroots activism. There were no marches in the streets of Polish cities. There were no sit-ins or any other type of protests from the repertoire of Western feminist movement, but it was rather through expert discourse, through the pressure from medical profession, and also from so-called Planned Parenthood activists, who are also very much experts, sexologists, doctors, pedagogues. And this created a completely different dynamic in terms of how reproductive rights were understood. So they were not understood as part of women's rights, but rather as part of family planning and as part of the state's policy towards family, well-being of families, always families, never women. So then it was quite easy in the 1980s to redefine the well-being of families into a more conservative way, and to say that well-being of families relies on the notion that women should stay at home and bear as many children as possible. But to be fair to the communist government, it was not only the well-being of the family that they were interested in, they also encouraged women to balance the family life and their participation in the workforce, enter male-dominated industries, especially in the 1950s, and provided, and to achieve this goal, provided a lot of support in the form of maternal leaves, kindergartens, creches, and other social provisions. So abortion and reproductive rights, although they didn't use this term, obviously, were understood as part of a broader vision of women being active in all spheres of public and private life. And so this is to sketch very broadly the situation of women in Poland and other state socialist countries before 1989. It's very interesting intellectually to see how after 1989, liberal intellectuals and even feminist circles managed to convince the public opinion that women are better off after the communists disappeared. And it relies on this very liberal notion that political freedoms in a very male-centered way are crucial to one's self-determination, while reproductive rights and equal opportunities are not so important for realizing one's own right to freedom. And I think that this is, of course, something that we should blame male intellectuals for, but we should also, like, obviously, and I'm thankful that in this panel we are discussing it, we should also critically examine the legacies of Western feminism in convincing many people and many groups that this was the only way of achieving feminist goals, while as we can see, state-directed policies in communist countries could achieve very similar goals in a completely different way. And then what we should think about is, was it feminist or not? And how do we define feminism, if not through this grassroots organizing pattern? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we're getting this really broad international perspective, because we can start to hone in some really interesting issues. Great, we can now move on to Shreya. Thank you.
Thanks, Scarlett. I must begin by saying that I'm absolutely loving hearing everyone on the panel. Manisha, Aili, Anna, thank you so much for such diverse and interdisciplinary perspectives. I believe we go into our silos, but when you hear feminist work being done in different quarters, you're like, wow, we're all really working on very similar things and are on about something very similar. So thank you so much, Scarlett and OPP, for organizing this and for your initiative in bringing the group together. I see the frustration behind starting a group like this, but it as an Oxford academic, it fills me with pride that undergraduates and graduates are coming together to do something like this. So really impressed with your work. I hope curriculum changes and this becomes more mainstream, but you'll only know once you do this. So with that, big thanks to everyone on the panel and to the group organizing this. Let me see how I'm going to dovetail with the different perspectives that are here. So let me first confess that I'm not a philosopher, and my interest in feminist revolutions, or perhaps feminist resistance, largely comes from the perspective of being a feminist lawyer. I work on human rights law and in particular on the right to equality and non-discrimination. And it's always interesting to look at that right to equality and non-discrimination from a feminist perspective in terms of how women have wielded that right. What has it done for women's emancipation wherever they're based? And it's so interesting always to see how women have activated law as a larger part of studying feminist revolution. So I do a very small part of what everyone else is doing here in terms of studying the feminist revolution, but perhaps I'm just doing a small part to see how exactly is law being wielded in these big feminist revolutions which are happening everywhere. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on Dalit feminist resistance in India. So we are now moving the furthest east perhaps so far that we've been. So going to the Indian subcontinent and thinking about the largest democracy in the world of 1.3 billion strong people, which is also happening to be home to the largest group of women in the world, but also importantly to the small group of, say, just about 300 million women who identify as Dalit or lower caste or belonging to a caste not high enough to enjoy the social privileges other castes enjoy. So let me break this down. We're talking about the phenomena of caste in India. Caste is basically the social hierarchy people are organized in Hindu religion, but not necessarily. So caste actually spans across religions in India, including Christianity and in Muslims. And it's a social hierarchy. It's an organization which pits people and locks them in the caste they belong to based on the family they're born into. So there's no way of checking out of caste. Last name reveal caste, and caste is a social ascription people can't really shrug off. Dalit, on the other hand, is a term used as a matter of assertive pride. It's a Marathi term. It's the language which people use in Maharashtra and beyond. And it basically means broken. It's a term which is used as a matter of assertive pride. It's very similar to the term black in terms of how it's being reclaimed and used as a matter of a self-affirmation and identity. So Dalit women are women who are off caste, who belong to the lowest rung or not even. So they belong beyond the caste hierarchy, right? So the lowest rungs of the caste hierarchy we're speaking of, and we're thinking about women who belong to those castes in particular. And we're thinking of Dalit women who happen to be about 250-300 million strong in India, and thinking about how exactly have Dalit women contributed to the women's movement in India. So the women's movement in India has adopted that term since the 1970s and 80s. And of course, the thing to notice about the movement in India is that it's post-colonial. So it's after the constitution was enacted in the 1950s that some of us study it in the legal sense, because that's when it starts to mean something in legal post-colonial constitutional terms to us. So we're thinking about the peak of feminist revolution, feminist resistance in the 1980s and 1970s, in fact, when it started. And we're thinking about where exactly do Dalit women feature in this? So in order to answer that question, I want to actually go back to October 2018. Google actually did this visualization which showed who is using #MeToo in India. And the purpose for doing that visualization was really that some people thought that #MeToo or the MeToo revolution or resistance or movement, whatever you want to call it, that #MeToo was really an urban elite movement. That it had, when it had traveled outside of the United States, not really had much of a bite or sting to it. It really was speaking to a particular kind of woman, straight, in the case of India, Brahmanical, so at the top of the order of the caste hierarchy of a certain class, so middle class perhaps, non-disabled. And there was a fear that it's only women of that certain kind that are relating to #MeToo. So when Google did that visualization, it turned out that the entire map of India lit up, showing that a lot of rural India seemed to be aware of #MeToo, or at least there was some perception that people all across India and women everywhere in India seemed to be using #MeToo. That gave the impression that perhaps Dalit women were always present in the feminist movement and had always contributed to the feminist movement. But at the same time, Dalit women issued this statement asking, we don't exactly see ourselves in this movement. And although we are happy to build solidarities across the movement and relate to others, we don't see ourselves as being represented. That revealed an interesting truth, that throughout the history of the feminist revolution, it turned out that Dalit feminists had always supported and given solidarity to the women's movement broadly, but they'd hardly ever received that solidarity back. So although they always contributed to the numbers on the streets to actually be protesting and being part of the feminist movement, they'd never actually been represented by or been seen as Dalit women in the women's movement in India. And here's the greatest example, which fits in exactly with what Manisha was saying, with what happened with the abolitionist movement. If you see the history of the feminist movement in India, it's based on resistance to sexual harassment and violence. Right? So every important point in the Indian feminist history is about resisting some form of assault, rape, sexual harassment, some kind of atrocity against women. And what is interesting is that at each of these points, I'm going to name them, you may not be aware of them, but just to sound out to you, some of these include the 1970s case of Mathura, which was a case about a tribal young girl who was raped in police custody, around which the feminist movement mobilized all across India. It led to the criminal laws being changed about police custody and rape in custody. That was the first significant post-colonial movement. The second is the case of Vishaka in state of Rajasthan, which is absolutely the locus classicus in international women's rights. So when you think of how judiciaries can activate sexual harassment laws, Vishaka is the gold standard. In this case, we're speaking of a rural Dalit woman who was gang raped by 5 men in 1992. In 1996, the Supreme Court went on to so moto take cognizance through an NGO which approached them and issued sexual harassment guidelines for when there was no legislation on this topic, right? So this is judicial activism peaking. So Vishaka is seen as this one moment which changed sexual harassment history in India. And then more recently, the Delhi gang rape, which people would be aware of, is speaking again of lower class women whose caste and class is almost erased from that conversation. The conversation is always around the big Guardian and BBC headline, if you remember, "Oh, India is dangerous for women," right? So these erasures of caste from the telling of the feminist movement, which is a telling really of the movement against or resistance against sexual harassment and violence, is telling exactly of the way that there's been an erasure of Black women from the history of sexual harassment law in the United States. So in the United States, you have Merita, which is the case which first recognized sexual harassment as a violation under Title VII, which is a case brought by a Black woman. It's the same with Anita Hill, but there were also litigants from that point when Michelle Vinson argued Merita until Anita Hill, scores of Black women who showed power to resist sexual harassment. It was their cases, but there was an erasure of race in that context, and there's an erasure of caste in the Indian context. Why does it all matter? I think it matters for 2 reasons. I think one is that there's a pretty technical point about causality, that what is the feminist movement is not really the feminist movement until it encompasses a broad identity of women who are actually leading it, right? So if the feminist movement is exclusively genderized or based on sex, then it's telling a very incomplete story, because, say, causally speaking, or the idea of legal causation, sexual harassment is not happening to women because they're women alone. It's just not true, right? So if you have to be very technical about what causes a particular form of harassment, you have to be clear about what leads to it. So Black and Dalit women are targeted for very specific reasons of being Black women and Dalit women. You just can't divorce Blackness and Dalitness out of women's bodies, right? So it happens for the reasons both of being Black and Dalit and women at the same time, right? So it matters for conceptually understanding the nature of what our women's rights are and how they're coming to be defined as feminist issues of our times. But more importantly, as Manisha said far better than I would, it is a matter of excavating and exhuming the histories of these movements and telling them right. As scholars and people in the academy, it should matter deeply to us. There is perhaps very little possibility of revolutions and resistance succeeding unless we get the telling of these stories right. And I think the bottom line for me is that if you hear these stories right, you know that intersectional feminism, whether in the United States or Europe or in India, you go around the world, scholars are working very hard to excavate these histories. Wherever you go, intersectional feminism seems to have formed the feminist movement from the center, from within. It's not something which is happening on the outside in the frills, it's just what has formed the movement. The fact that movement has sometimes erased their contribution or not seen it or not recognized it doesn't change that fact. It is because intersectional feminism has existed, I would argue, that so much of the good law on sexual harassment that has come to be, but also so much of what is left to be is shown to us at all. We would never recognize that unless we see that intersectional feminism has been much present in the history of feminist movement and resistance. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks for hearing.
Great, thank you. That was amazing. I'm learning so much. I don't know about everyone else. And last we've got Tess. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a really fascinating talk. And I think some of what I'm going to say is maybe going to speak to some of that, and in fact to quite a few of the discussions that we've already heard today. So as Scarlett mentioned earlier, I'm a historian, and my PhD thesis, which I've just submitted, looks at the 1970s women's liberation movement in transnational perspective through a case study of the links between the movements in the UK, US, and France. So through archival research and life history interviews with women's liberation activists, I explore how theory, protest tactics, and organizational ideas traveled, how movements in different countries inspired each other, but also the limits of that transnational influence. And I look at these questions from activist awakenings and movement formation through to specific areas of activity like protest, healthcare, and the establishment of services like rape crisis centres and refuges. To explain this work to people unfamiliar with the women's liberation movement, I often reach for the word revolution or revolutionary. I don't look at 1970s feminism generally, or second wave feminism as it's sometimes called. I leave aside the reformist strand of the women's movement, like, for example, American Now, the National Organization for Women, and other groups that pushed for legislative change through official channels, so lobbyists, legal foundations, professional organizations. Instead, what interests me is the kind of more radical, more grassroots women's movement. Of course, women's liberation activists also pushed for legislative change, but there are very stark differences between the aims and the structures of each branch of the women's movement. So women's liberation activists wanted women's complete liberation, and that was a project that required going beyond legal reform or institutional representation. They didn't want to just share in men's power, they wanted to raise the entire system of power, the patriarchy, to the ground. And that's where I reach for the term revolution. For me, women's liberation was a revolutionary project in that it was comprehensive, ambitious, imaginative, and it aimed to change lives, minds, and change society. And for me, I think that revolution captures that dramatic, far-reaching change. So as I said, this is reflected in structural differences between the two branches of the women's movement. The reformist movement primarily operated top-down through formal organizations with constitutions, designated roles, directorships. You might join an organization like that through a membership application. Men often participated and in some cases even held leadership roles. Conversely, women's liberation was women only. It emerged from the grassroots, as I said. It was messy, staunchly leaderless, with very few overarching organizational instruments. And because of that, groups were more varied, the links between groups were organic, and the methods of struggle were diverse. So from consciousness raising groups, street theatre, squatting, to women's refuges, healthcare centres, bookshops and cafes. So I think that revolution is a useful concept for me, although I have to admit that it's not really one that I've thought deeply about before. Of course, this event has given me a chance to think a little bit more about what revolution meant to the women that I study. So I went back over some of my sources to explore this question. I found that many uses of the term that I came across came from women's involvement in pre-women's liberation activism, so the civil rights movement, student movements, and trade unions. And those sources talked about the ways that women were marginalized within 1960s revolutionary projects. So one British activist told me women fled socialist groups like IS and IMG in their droves once there was a women's movement, because they had been battling unsuccessfully against all these completely unmoving socialist blokes who would say, "After the revolution, my dear." Then in the late 1960s, women began meeting together and discussing the societal oppression that they experienced as women. And in the first written explorations of this oppression, they appealed to other activists by invoking their revolutionary credentials. So for example, in Monique Wittig's 1970 manifesto, which was the first to emerge from the French women's liberation movement, she invoked the example of Olympe de Gouges, who Manisha mentioned earlier, saying, "We, as in women, have the right to mount the rostrum since we have the right to mount the scaffold." We know, wrote Wittig, that we are part of the vast revolutionary movement that since May 1968 has changed the aspect of struggles in France, of which the goal is the overthrow of capitalism and the takeover of power by the people. We are the people. So revolution was still used in these very early sources to discuss kind of other more general revolutionary projects. But it was around this time, 1968 to 70, that women moved to organize autonomously and build their own movement. And so from the early 1970s, you do find a very clear shift in the source material as women begin to speak of feminist revolution and our revolution. Of course, there were very different, often conflicting understandings of revolution within the women's liberation movement, how it would be brought about, what counted as revolutionary. Of course, I don't have time to produce a comprehensive map of the movement here, but one crude illustration might be the difference between socialist, radical, and revolutionary feminists. So one of my interviewees described the difference between these strands of the movement by saying that socialist feminists saw class as the paramount structural framework that oppressed people, and within that oppressed women. Radical feminism, she said, gave another lens, and that lens was about the way that men oppressed women on both institutional and personal levels. Then revolutionary feminism, which emerged in Britain in the late 1970s, took this one step further to argue that men are the enemy, that all men oppress all women. So you can see how these different understandings of women's oppression would lead to different conceptions of revolution and how best to achieve it. So for socialist umbrella group CWLU, that's the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, they thought that women were denied power because of their class position. And CWLU shared, as they wrote, the socialist vision of a humanist world made possible through a redistribution of wealth. Revolutionary feminists, in contrast, asserted their struggle was against male supremacy specifically, and so they saw male violence as an instrument of control, they saw heterosexuality as harmful. So within the movement, activists continually grappled with the questions of how to understand and how to achieve revolution, as I imagine that activists within most, if not all, revolutionary movements do. Another question often grappled with was how revolutionary is our movement, how revolutionary are our aims, and key critiques from Black activists and working class activists posed exactly this question. I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with the Combahee River Collective statement. For those who aren't familiar with it, the collective originally began as the Boston chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization, founded in 1973, before the collective split off a few years later. And their analysis, laid out in their 1977 statement, had emerged from consciousness raising discussions. So in other words, speaking about and collectively analyzing the conditions of their lives. And that understanding was grounded in the collective's concept of identity politics, which meant something very different to the way that it's used nowadays. We believe, they wrote, that the most profound and potentially the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In terms of revolution and how to bring it about, the collective was socialists, but, they asserted, we are not convinced that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. And for them, their position at the bottom, as they put it, could be used to make a clear leap into revolutionary action. If Black women were free, they said, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And that brings me back to my original use for the concept of revolution to explain how ambitious women's liberation was. Because if revolution requires something dramatic, a complete upturning, then the question, whose revolution, makes sense. You know, is this feminist revolution a complete upturning? Activists asked, are our aims truly revolutionary? Just as it makes sense for activists to ask themselves, well, how can we achieve this revolution? So I hope I've given a very brief sense of the kind of range of answers to those questions that the 1970s women's liberation movement gave. But I think the main thing that I took, at least from my own exploration of revolution in preparing this, is perhaps that those kinds of questions can't be fully resolved, and that for activists, the concept of a revolution requires a continuous process of thinking, rethinking, learning, dialogue, and debate. I'm conscious that there's one further question that I haven't touched upon, which I should be able to answer as a historian, which is, to what extent was this revolution successful? But maybe we'll have time to discuss that question as we move into the discussion. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. That's given me a lot to think about. I'm hoping everyone else as well. So we're now going to do about 20 minutes, I think, of open discussion. So if any of you guys, the speakers, would like to start us off with a question for another member of the panel, or suggest a direction you'd like the topic to go in, or the conversation to go in, that would be great. Brilliant. Yeah.
So I was thinking, I'm sorry I was AWOL in the middle, but I actually was doing an interview with Canadian TV on the presidential elections, but I'm back. I was thinking a little bit about what Aili said about how wars and revolutions quicken the movement for women's rights. And I think to a certain degree that's true for also anti-colonial movements that began after the Second World War. Certainly in the case of India, maybe Shreya can talk more knowledgeably than I can. One sees the emergence of feminism within the Indian national movement, within the process of decolonization immediately after the Second World War. But that was something that had happened for a long time. And again, you can trace it right back to the 19th century. But I kind of buy that idea, this notion that when there is an expansion of democracy, not liberal democracy, but democracy with a small d at the local level, that all these questions come up, and particularly the question of women's rights. And maybe Anna and Aili could talk a little bit about this, because it seems to me that in the case of Poland, it's this kind of neoliberalism that actually has resulted in a backlash and it's just going backwards in terms of women's rights, particularly. But that was just a question, and I thought maybe you both could address that. Unmute
myself here. It's certainly in the African context, the liberation movements. If you look at Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you did see within that context a push for the expansion of women's rights, but it didn't necessarily happen. In other words, it wasn't a necessity. It only happened under certain circumstances, and there, I think part of it has to do with the timing. So South Africa and Namibia, for example, you see this very clearly, the pattern, but it's also within an international environment where certain kinds of political rights are being discussed, especially after the 1995 UN Conference on Women in Beijing. In Zimbabwe, it started, the 1980 was when the war ended and they became independent, and that was a different time. And so you don't see the same, and you didn't have the same, you had a women's movement, but it wasn't pushing in the same way that you saw in Namibia and South Africa, and so there was much less impact. You know, I think there are many different conditions that have to be at play for one to see changes. There's no necessity to it. But it's an opportunity, it's a moment of opportunity. It's a time when there are possibilities. And then perhaps there's a time when that moment closes and it becomes much harder. I was gonna ask Anna about, because one of the points that you made was that the pre-1990s policies where the state, state feminism, if you want to call it that, was encouraging allowing for abortion to serve the production imperative. And then you said that it made it possible then later to get rid of those rights. And I'm just trying to figure out what's the mechanism of how did that make it possible? Wasn't it more the opening up to the influence of the church, Catholic Church and so on, that made it more likely, and not something about the communist period?
Thanks. It's actually the two questions that you both asked are kind of connected, because they very much, like, to answer them, we must look into the so-called solidarities revolution. And again, we have a word revolution perhaps a bit too much. Like it was not a revolution in a sense of any violent or even revolutionary change, actually, but still people perceive it as such. And yeah, and I think it very much shows that there is no direct link between this revolutionary situation in terms of like broader political panorama and like improving women's position or opening floor for campaigning for women's rights. And there is probably some of you are familiar with this wonderful book by Shanna Penn, which is called Solidarity's Secret. And she did interviews with women activists who were active in the Solidarity trade union, so the anti-communist opposition in 1980s Poland. And because there were a lot of women, and they were quite they were responsible for the movement's success, especially during the martial law period when the movement had to go underground, and women, because of their stages as women, were less suspected of oppositional activity by the authorities, so they could move more freely around the city, distribute underground press, etc., etc. But then in 1989, when it comes to political decisions, women disappear from the picture. So they are not members of the, there is only one woman at the roundtable talks in 1989. And women's issues such as reproductive rights are pushed aside and then traded for some cooperation with the Catholic Church. And Shanna Penn asked them, like the women who were active in Solidarity, how was it possible? And none of them could give an answer. So this is something that actually demands more research into actually how those revolutionary movements managed to use the situation of the revolution to push women's issues aside and to push women activists aside and convince the audience and also the activists that there are more important things than pushing women's agenda. And then in Polish case, obviously, there is a huge role of the Catholic Church in this. And here's a question of family planning and production that becomes really important, because when in the 1980s, the Solidarity movement, with the support of the church, grew stronger, what they campaigned for was a return to traditional gender norms. So, and you can see it clearly in a very progressive demands from Gdańsk shipyard in 1980, which is like one of the biggest strikes against the government. And they have these 21 demands that they hang on the gate to the shipyard. And one of them is to introduce 3 years paid maternity leaves. So it's clearly like the gender ideal is to push women back to their homes, to care for the children, not to be active on in the workforce. And it's very visible then in how the history of the communist period got written after 1989, with many historians interpreting the agenda of the government, trying to convince women to work and to enter male-dominated industries as actually anti-women. So actually government using women for its own productive goals, and not like completely ignoring the fact that for many of the women that was like their life, like that they really wanted to work, and they were really sad when they were fired after 1989. So I think that this very the conflict between these two political powers in Poland had a very gender character, which is very much underestimated in the interpretations of the post-communist revolution, if we want to stick to the term. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so I had a question actually for both Shreya and Tess. I really valued the way both of you looked at the experiences of marginalized women in particular to talk about broader issues in feminism. And with Shreya honing in on the issue of sexual assault and rape, which has, you know, traditionally and even currently been used as a way to dominate women, right? And the fact that it affects particularly Dalit women or marginalized women is really interesting for me, because in the United States, the rape laws was so defined in the South that you could only rape a white woman. You could not rape even a black woman. And Mississippi, just before the Civil War, passed a law saying, well, maybe a black child under the age of 12. But that law was never implemented because, you know, the Civil War broke out. So the first cases of rape against Black women are actually prosecuted by the Union Army, which is an occupying force in the South during the Civil War. So it really spoke to me, your presentation of how sexual assault and rape have been used, in particular against marginalized women, women of lower caste, lower class, and Dalit. And it got me to Tess's beautiful reading of the statement of the Combahee River Collective. And I just wanted to add that the reason why they call themselves Combahee River is because Harriet Tubman led a Union Army assault in Combahee River during the Civil War. So to me, it was really amazing that these Black women, you know, in the 1970s and 80s were aware of Tubman's role in leading that assault and named themselves after that particular assault. So it seems, you know, here they are, you know, using this idea that if Black women are free, everyone will be free, but that they are also really aware of the historical roots of their activism. And I just wanted, I was wondering if you had found anything in their papers, because I have read the statement, but I've never researched it. But if you found anything in their papers where they explicitly know this and acknowledge it.
I don't think I have found anything specifically. I mean, I would say that I mean, that's something that you find kind of across the movement generally. I think there was a sense that although this was kind of the long roots of feminist activism, there was a sense of that history having been forgotten, as it so often is forgotten, and then having to be recovered again. And so I think, you know, across the movement, you find feminist groups naming themselves after their feminist foremothers, and reclaiming some of those ideas. And, you know, I think that they also then were interested in writing their own history so that future generations of feminists wouldn't have to kind of reinvent the wheel every time. But unfortunately, you know, these women have been written out of many histories, and we're still facing the same issue of having to reclaim those narratives.
Shreya, I was wondering if you wanted to add something to that.
Thanks, Manisha. I'll probably use the thing Manisha ended on, which is just so beautiful, that intersectional feminism and Black feminism was really about revolution for everyone. It was through them that they wanted to emancipate everything and transform, upturn, overturn everything. You know, a major overhaul was what they were after. They weren't sort of, you know, looking for emancipation for themselves. It was for everyone, as Manisha said. So perhaps it's a question for the audience, and just to think about how much has that idea sort of sustained, and what's the uptake of that idea? That because I sometimes feel like there's a misunderstanding that somehow intersectional feminism is sending us back into these little silos, and we're not meant to understand one another, and it's really quite selfish, and you know, every individual and their position, they must fight, and only the collective nature of it, the fact that this is meant to really transform and change and revolutionize. I mean, the word transformation exists and appears from 18th century literature on Black feminism until now. Like, it's such a significant word. Is that well understood? Is there uptake of that today, or is it less understood? Is it misunderstood? I'd be very keen to hear how much of that is significant in terms of how much it defines our current feminist politics?
You know, I think there's a tendency, especially in the US, to dismiss it as, you know, Tess, I think, pointed out very correctly in her presentation, as simple identity politics, which it really, if you look at what these women are saying, is not. You know, they're addressing this in a much bigger way. So, you know, even the kind of mainstream liberation movements in the United States is what is known as second wave feminism, though people have challenged that metaphor of waves. You know, we can see that, you know, with Gloria Steinem, you always had Dorothy Pitman Hughes, but no one talks about Dorothy Pitman Hughes. One of my very good friends is now writing a biography on her. But when Dorothy Pitman Hughes came up and she talked about women's liberation, she brought up all these issues that working class women, women of color face, like childcare, etc., you know, demanding such, you know, basic social democratic policies. Of course, we in the United States are completely like 100 years behind Europe in discussions of these, because everything is socialism and communism and it can't be done, right? But you know, I do think that it is important to go beyond that. I think many times we get described by our opponents in certain ways that it makes it easy to dismiss us. And I think identity politics is one of those, including feminism, you know, as women's issues. You know, I'm thinking of Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the Grimke sisters, abolitionist feminists. They were the first ones who said, Angelina Grimke is the first person who said that women's rights are human rights. You know, not everyone says it in the 20th century, but she said this in the 1830s. And, you know, I really think it's important for us to, in fact, not think about it in those narrow ways, and to think about how these struggles are so interconnected and how they contribute to a broader democratic project. And you know, I'm constantly fighting against that, because in the US, Aili will know too, the so-called culture wars really use these kinds of ways to create divisions and to create those kinds. And sometimes people buy into it. And I think there's a danger there. And I think one really needs to kind of step back and figure out what exactly is happening in terms of politics broadly when people do that.
I mean, back in the, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, the Combahee River Collective were well aware that they would have those kinds of accusations thrown at them. And, you know, from all sides as well, you know, both from like white women and from Black men saying, you know, why are you just interested in yourselves? As though, you know, to talk about one's own oppression is to ignore all other oppressions. And they just, in their statement, they just have to very specifically say, you know, we're not separatists. We don't just want to fight for ourselves in discussing our own oppression. You know, we want to build solidarity with different groups to work on different things. And that, I think, speaks to, I think Bell Hooks had a really interesting 1980s exploration of sisterhood and what it means, and argued, you know, that sisterhood doesn't have to be based on an understanding of all women experience oppression in the same way. It can be based on difference, and discussion and true solidarity needs to take account of those differences.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a different kind of question of Manisha? It was fascinating to hear your account of these earlier takes on intersectionality, and I'd like to ask how has the understandings changed? You know, from how are these earlier understandings different than the one put forward by Crenshaw or by Patricia Hale Collins or by Leslie McCall? You know, the idea of the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. I mean, how were these earlier understandings different than what we have today? In other words, what's the evolution of thinking?
That's a great question, Aili, because, you know, the concept of intersectionality is something that, of course, you know, just the term comes up with Kimberly Crenshaw and others, this notion of overlapping oppressions. You know, these 19th century origin moments, if I can call them that, they may not have, they certainly did not use the term feminism. They didn't use the term intersectionality. They didn't use the term womanism or any of the terms that we use now. But what I argue in my book, and I'm arguing this also in this current book that I'm writing on the reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, is that they are in fact gesturing towards those ideas. When they're talking about, explicitly the triple burdens of, class, race, or gender, or when somebody like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in her famous speech to the 1866 Women's Rights Convention says, "You white women speak of rights, I speak of wrongs." So immediately, what are wrongs? And she's talking about Black freed women in the after the Civil War being murdered, raped, and tortured for just being Black women. And no longer being enslaved. And so, they are constantly bringing this out without perhaps the theoretical heft that people like Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins brings to them. But I think we need to be mindful. And I think they probably would agree with that. And I carried the story forward a little bit in this new book that I'm doing that goes right up to the turn of the century by looking not just at African-American feminists, but also at what were known then as social feminists, but who could be identified as, socialist feminists or social democratic feminists, maybe radical feminists. They are talking about people like Jane Addams, et cetera. There were people involved in the settlement house movements, et cetera. They really should be seen not just as progressive reformers, but also as feminists who, for instance, are in the board of the NAACP and at the same time are involved with issues of unionization in northern cities, and at the same time are involved with questions of women's rights. So I looked a lot at them. I mean, I kind of rediscovered them. So I think there are many other origin points to intersectionality. And the one historian who actually looks at these women, Linda Gordon, also made that point. She responded, I think there was an issue of a journal that was devoted to looking at what happened to Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality. And she pointed to these women. And I kind of agree with her. And I would even broaden the lens because she mentioned a few of these white women. And I would broaden it to include people like Ida B. Wells, who linked anti-lynching. Ironically, of course, Shreya, Black men wrongly accused of raping white women, right? So, the idea of sexual assault could also be used to discipline lower classes and people of color in sometimes in reactionary ways. But that's how I would explain it, that there's a history behind the theoretical formulation that sometimes maybe the people who do political theory and people who do critical race theory may not be aware of, but we as historians need to point that out. And just to end with the person who really does do this, and since this is a philosophy Zoom webinar, I should mention her, is of course Anna Julia Cooper in her famous A Voice from the South, where she actually theoretically is a theoretical predecessor to people like Collins and Crenshaw. And what was interesting when I was researching Anna Julia Cooper, I found that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where you can find anything, a quick rundown on Kant, a quick rundown on the categorical imperative, you can run to the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy and they have a great section on Anna Julia Cooper and her feminist philosophy and her intersectionalism. So I started reading all these philosophers who were writing about Anna Julia Cooper and who had done actually a better job of understanding her than historians who can sometimes be theoretically impoverished. Not that I mean to diss my own profession, but yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Can I just jump in quickly and say that obviously we have hit the time. Obviously I'm happy to keep going if people want to, but if people have to go, that's also fine. I'd also like to just give the audience the chance to ask some questions if anyone's got any. If they don't, it's such a brilliant, rich discussion. Like, I'm happy to keep going with that if people would like to. I'm really enjoying this kind of sense of rediscovering the feminist history because I really, what Shreya said really resonated with me. I think there's such a misunderstanding, even me learning in my course, 2 weeks ago, like really properly digging into like intersectional texts, there is this sense of this kind of fracturing, and there's this criticism of why are you talking about your own liberation? We want to talk about everyone's liberation. And I think that really does come from the fact that historically we see the movement as this kind of cohesive white woman, it starts with white women, it's ending with white women, and so if you start to bring these perspectives back in, we go, oh, why are you breaking up? This movement is good, it's cohesive, it works. But obviously, as you've all said so beautifully, it didn't start with white women, and they've always, people of marginalized groups have always been there in the center. And so I think this has taught me so much about, the tools that we can use historically and philosophically to, rediscover those roots. So thank you all so much. If anybody has got a question from the audience, you can just message the chat saying that you would like to ask it in person, or you can just put your question and then I'll ask it for you. So yeah, if anyone has any questions. So Henna says he or she wants to ask a question in person. So feel free to turn on your audio. Go for it.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for that amazing and very rich discussion. I wanted to ask Professor Sinha in particular a question. I was thinking about Shreya's question to the audience. How much do these feminisms define our current feminist politic? And Aili's talk about the evolution and differences from those abolitionist feminists you talked about. And when you mentioned abolitionist feminism, I immediately thought of Angela Davis and her forthcoming book, which I'm sure you've heard of, Abolition Feminism Now. And she herself she self-consciously calls her feminism abolitionist feminism. But of course, her abolitionist feminism is about rejecting caging of people, about defunding the police, about the carceral state. I was wondering if you could talk more about that relationship, I guess, from Angela Davis to your abolitionist feminists in the 19th century, and maybe what this recurring theme of abolition might tell us about American social movements. Yeah.
Oh, what a great question, Hannah, and a big one. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's a great question because, Angela Davis is one person who, of course, is kind of an iconic figure when it comes to the 60s movements, right, across the board. And she still remains at the forefront of radical social movements, fighting against, mass incarceration, against, for prison abolition and things like that. I think Angela Davis very consciously uses the term abolition. Even her book, Abolition Democracy, was a term that was used immediately after the Civil War by W.E.B. Du Bois to describe Reconstruction in the South, which established Black male citizenship in the South. Of course, it was overthrown, and then you had the regime of racial terror, Jim Crow, etc. But I think she's very conscious of that history, and she's very conscious of using abolition as a kind of a radical standard, in terms of a movement. Because if you think of the abolitionists of the 19th century, they were seen as these crazy radical fanatics. They were the most radical. I've been thinking of Tess's different definitions of radical and revolutionary, but they were seen as out there because not only were they fighting against slavery, they were fighting for Black equality, and that was seen as, completely out of the question. So I think she uses the term abolition really well. And if you look at her early work, the one on, I think it's Women, Race, and Class, where she talks about the experiences of enslaved women, it's quite clear to me that she sees her abolitionist feminism as coming from this very grassroots struggles of African American women under slavery, which I argue in my book should be seen as part of the abolition movement. We don't think of slave resistance as a part of the abolition movement, but it ought to be seen as part of it. So I think there is a connection there. Now, not to be very simplistic and parallel about it, I think it does change a lot. In the 20th century, we have very different issues. And I think in terms of what we see today in the US, systemic racism, police brutality, all this, I would call them the afterlives of slavery in the United States. And the fact that Angela Davis chooses to use the term abolition signals that this is an ongoing radical struggle of an interracial social movement against systemic racism. So, I think she is very mindful of that. I think she knows that. I've had the pleasure to meet her a few times and talk to her. And it is amazing how well versed she is in the previous struggles that Black people have historically launched in this country. So yeah.
Thank you so much. That answered it brilliantly.
Thank you.
Has anyone else got any more questions? If not, if any of the speakers have anything left over from the discussion that they want to wrap up, we can move on to that, or we can finish up whatever people are feeling like.
Yeah, I do need to get going too. I think Shreya had a different call, but yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. Really learned a lot from everyone, so I really enjoyed this. Thanks for having us, Scarlett.
You're very welcome. Yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming. I'd like to thank Shruti, the events coordinator, who is running the next and final talk of the term. Obviously, a massive thank you to our guest speakers, such insightful comments, and I thought it rounded off really well. Really, really pleased. So the next talk is on Wednesday the 18th at 5 p.m. And that'll be posted on the WHIP page and OPP. If any of the speakers would like the link, I'll forward it on. That's with Dexnell Peters, Manuel Barcia Paz, Gerard Aking, and Manisha Sinha again, looking at 18th and 19th century decolonization. So that's going to be really exciting. Also, this is really relevant. Tomorrow at 5 p.m, OPP are doing their critical discussion groups on Africana philosophy with Professor Tommy Curry from the University of Edinburgh. And he's looking at Africana philosophy as a decolonial method. And I've been informed by Alessandra that the discussion here fits very nicely into that. So if you enjoyed this, make sure to tune into that as well. They're also doing a group on Africana philosophy and feminism on the 3rd of December. So that would also be very relevant. And this will all be on the Facebook page. Yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you for organising. Thank you.
Thank you for making my first academic panel such a lovely experience. Okay, great. Yeah, cool. I will stop the recording.